When the tides of war relentlessly drown me in a sea of blood, I find comfort in thinking there are places in the galaxy where absolutely nothing happens. That was written in the journal of a soldier that fought in the final war from its first day to its last. Ever since I found out about it, that line has stuck with me. For nearly my entire 8 years of service, whenever I would have downtime, it would run through my head over and over. For me, it was true. No matter what I was going through or what was happening around me, thinking about the quiet and peaceful parts of the galaxy brought me comfort. As for who I am, my name is Edward Reed. I am a former First Sergeant from the 1077th Infantry Division, 245th Army, 13th Army Group. At least, that is the final rank I held when I was discharged. I'm sure you know me from my tours, but I like repeating it so people don't forget. I am just one man from an army of billions. My therapist is the one that encouraged me to partake in this book. Said, telling my story would be good for me. I don't see the point. I've told my story every morning day to entire auditoriums of people since the end of the war, at least the part anyone seems to care about, and it never makes me feel any better. But hey, better than sitting at home alone and staring at the wall, I guess. On that date, which has gone down in history as Mourning Day, I, like many others, was going about my business as normal. I had just gotten home from the store when my wife called for me to come and see something. She was watching a council session like she always did, wherever one would be going on, and she was home. But as we all know, this wasn't just another council session. It would turn out to be the council session of the century. I'd watched a few of them before with her but never cared too deeply about what was going on in the galaxy outside of my little bubble. Alexandra Hansen had just started giving the speech. We watched, and when it was over, I knew things were never gonna be the same. That said, I wasn't a volunteer. I wasn't afraid to fight, but I had a wife and 3 kids to take care of. I wasn't running off to go get killed on some faraway planet. Of course, fate had a different plan for me. A few weeks later, I got my draft notice. When my wife found out, I could tell she wanted to burst into tears, but she held them in, saying, "This is your duty as a human. If you perform it as well as you have the one you have as a husband and father, you'll be back before you know it." I don't know if she truly meant the last part, but regardless, that was that. I couldn't legally refuse, but after she said that to me, how could I even contemplate doing anything else but answering the call? So I packed a small handful of things. I figured they'd be taken anyway, and the next day she drove me to the recruitment office. As I hugged my wife goodbye for what turned out to be the last time, I silently cursed my physical fitness. I wish I'd never gone to a gym. I'd have probably been called up anyway if I had survived the shattering, but I still would have gotten another few years with her. Once we parted, I reported to the man in charge of the recruitment office. I was one of about 100 other men from my town. The man, a Sergeant Elter if I remember right, took my notice and went through some preliminary tests and filled out some forms to make sure there hadn't been any changes since my last physical. Once that was done, I was taken to the small on-site clinic and had my neural interface implanted in the base of my skull. Those things itch like a bitch when you first get them, and it's weird to know you have a chunk of silicon and titanium in your head, but you get used to it. Once the last of us came in and had their interfaces implanted, we were loaded onto the bus that would take us to UUST or One Unit One Site training. We'd realized long ago that if someone went through all their training with the same people and were instructed by the same person, they developed a stronger camaraderie and tended to fight better and more intensely. Thanks to that, I got to go through training only with people from my home province. Oh yeah, I'm from Great Plains, on the North American continent. I'm sure you already know that, but hey, maybe you don't. So I got to train only with other Plains guys. It was nice. While I don't remember much from Uust aside from months of waking up at ungodly hours for 10-mile ruck marches, learning how to kill a man right in my face with my bare hands, or from 600 yards away with a rifle, building things just to blow them up, and getting lost in the Himalayas once. I do remember that it was nice to be with people that had many of the same experiences, beliefs and customs I did. Anyway, Uust lasted for 6 months. I was given the rare choice of whether to go to an advanced training school where I would have developed my engineering skills even more as well, receive the leadership training needed to become an NCO, but I decided not to. I wasn't really suited to leadership, or at least I thought so at the time. Again, fate would prove I was meant for something else. Once training was over, my unit, now designated the 1077th Infantry Division, was packed into transports attached to the 5th Fleet for the retaking of the Epsilon system. It held quite a few mineral-rich asteroids in its belts, with the sole planet being home to a decently sized and developed human colony. It had been one of the last systems taken by the Hadzai, so everyone had been evacuated long before that. Still, it was close to Sol, so it was to be our first target. Kind of like a warm-up, the campaign to retake the cluster had started a few months previously, but this would be our first taste of combat. Least we were told that. The trip was uneventful, it really just felt just like any transport we'd taken during training. It was expected since we were so far from Hadzai space, and with nearly half the Hadzai's navy gone, they had nothing to harass us with anyway. When we got into orbit, it was about 12 hours before we loaded into those damn ancient T-45 dropships. Sure, they had the space for an entire company, but barely. They also had a tendency to shudder violently if it was in atmosphere and the pilot needed to turn hard at anything near normal flying speeds. Still, they were built like tanks and could take a lot of fire before endangering the crew. Wouldn't stop a missile or AA railgun, but infantry weapons had a tough time doing damage. The later T-50 was a big improvement, comfort-wise, but I wish they'd kept some of the armor. As they lifted off the cargo hold's floor, everyone got quiet. I think it hit everyone that this wasn't just training. We might have been going to a human-owned asteroid, but for all we knew, the moment we breached Atmo, we'd have been torn apart by enemy fire. This was the real deal. So once we got through the sky without being shot at, we started looking at each other. Why didn't we get shot at? Did they not have the weapons to do any damage? Were they even still there? We quickly found out as we touched down, and the rear-facing door opened. The men directly behind it raised their rifles as they prepared to charge, but they then lowered them as they came out. Once everyone was on the ground, we started looking around the makeshift camp that had been our landing zone. Instead of gunfire, we were greeted by the sight of men just lazing around, basking in the sun, or having a bite to eat. None of them had their combat gear on, only their multi-camo uniforms. One of them, also from Great Plains judging from his accent, greeted us sarcastically. "Welcome to nowhere, boys. You guys can sling those rifles. Ain't nothing here." As it turned out, we were not the first troops to make landfall. The guys of the 907th Infantry had been the first, and they hadn't encountered any resistance either. Nobody had seen fit to inform us of that. However, it took a few days to confirm it, but it seemed the Hadzai had managed to slip recon and evacuate all of their troops before we'd shown up. This was known when the 907th landed, but no one told them either, so everyone got all hyped up for nothing. As it turned out, this became a common occurrence. The entire Epsilon system was empty. The Hadzai had abandoned it all, not before destroying damn near everything of value that wasn't buried in the ground, but they were gone. For weeks, this was the case. We'd come in land, and find nothing, and no one. We started to joke that it seemed the war would be over without us having to fire a shot, that all we needed to do to win was let the Hadzai know we were coming, and they'd go running. System after system was taken, and within about 6 months, we'd reclaimed over 75% of the cluster. We knew, however, that we'd eventually hit resistance, because at least once a month, we'd offer the HFY peace under the simple terms of everything returning to the status quo, as it was before they'd invaded. Each time, they refused. So they clearly had something planned, and they did. They called it burn and run. We call it scorched earth. The idea was to pretty much pull everything out of most of the Hyades cluster and back to their home territory to better concentrate their now limited resources. While doing so, they destroyed anything and everything they could. Factories, mines, stockpiles. Where they could, they even detonated nuclear weapons that were purposefully dirty in and around mineral-rich areas, so as destroy as much as possible, and to contaminate the area so we couldn't use it until it had been cleared. Full-on scorched earth policy. They did, however, make sure that when they did this, it wasn't in an area where civilians would be impacted. Personally, I think our rules of war had scared them. We considered the destruction of possibly valuable military assets during a retreat as a valid tactic, so there was no rule against it. Long as they watched their step around civilian areas, which they did. For the time being, the war was a cakewalk. Then we finally hit the outer limit of their planned defensive sphere, the area they planned to start fighting us. The first planet was Ava, where those terrorists once held a city hostage with a nuke. Maybe the HFY intended to send some kind of message, I don't know. This time, when we hit orbit, our ships found they couldn't scan the surface. It seemed like they had installed their alter jammers on the planet. They could confuse and jam sensors. They had had these stationed around many of the targets from the first strike, but they consumed a lot of power, so they were only activated when a threat was detected. We were surprised they deployed them so far from home, but I guess they wanted every advantage they could, and they were pretty through with their destruction when it was clear they'd lost. It'd take us years to actually capture one intact and develop proper countermeasures. For the time being, though, their presence ruled out orbital bombardment, as we had no way of targeting something like a ground force accurately enough to make the destruction of the environment worth it. The HFY might not have cared about what happened to it, but since we planned on using each planet or asteroid we took as soon after their capture as we could, to support the advance, we did care. So it was going to be a ground war. We were also far enough into the cluster that they could have been sending men and supplies to the planet for months before we started monitoring it. So we send in drones at first. That ended up not working, as once they got close enough to the planet, the same interference that was blocking scans killed the control signal. This one surprised us. At the time we didn't think the alter jammers had the ability to jam encrypted control signals as well as targeting sensors. But we'd just have to adapt. So with the use of drones out, we resorted to manned recon flights. Can't jam a human. You can, of course, intercept a manned craft, which they tried. The SR-101 surveillance plane, however, was quite fast, and their interceptors, which our pilots called pins since they were so slender, aside from the cockpit at the front, had a hard time catching them. A few were downed, but we gathered enough intel for a plan. In general, the 245th and 134th Armies would land on the eastern end of the southern continent, and the 192nd and 222nd Armies would land on the western end of the northern continent. From there the two armies would fight their way towards each other. Each army was made up of 4 infantry, 1 tank, and 1 artillery division. As I mentioned before, my unit, the 1077th, was a part of the 245th. Overall, the 4 armies made up the 13th Army Group and consisted of 500,000 men. Seems small for taking an entire planet, but we also had another 1.5 million men in the 43rd and 26th Army Groups, as well as the renowned 1st Army Group in orbit as reinforcements, if they were needed. Altogether, these units made up the 2nd Regional Army. Not to mention that this was just the first line. Their goal was to bog us down and give the second line and onward more time to prepare. So our estimates put the number of HFY on the planet at just 2 million. Technically we were outnumbered, but they needed to defend an entire planet, so they were pretty spread out trying to defend every likely landing zone. The 245th target would be the city of New Paris. Recon showed the city to be lightly defended, making it a good landing point. Take it, wait for the 134th to land to reinforce us, then get moving before the HFY could contain. This time, when we breached Atmo, we did take fire. Surface-to-space missiles at first, then surface-to-air missiles, before finally hitting the effective range of their anti-air railguns. It seemed altered jammers could jam our equipment without affecting theirs, which was a tad surprising to us. We did, however, have jammers of our own. This made their SSMs useless, but the SMs did have a backup manual mode that used laser guidance. Still, it made it much harder to hit us. It was the railguns, however, that did the most damage. Post-battle analysis showed that of all the T-45 SAs that were shot down in that first wave, 90% were due to these railguns. Still, there were thousands of dropships in the skies, so most made it through. This wasn't like storming a beach, however. Once we'd made it, there wasn't any single direction we needed to face. We were scattered throughout the city, so we needed to first secure the area around us before then moving on to link up with other units throughout the city. It was one hell of a slog because even with a company of 200 men, it takes time to search and secure a 50-story skyscraper. We did it though. The HFY did put up some resistance, and we took some casualties when they collapsed a skyscraper down on some guys, but within a day, New Paris was under our control. The 134th came in and we established a perimeter around the city before moving out. The HFY failed to respond properly, and within 3 months, we'd linked up with the other half of the 13th and got reinforced by the 43rd. I saw some combat during the Ava campaign, but not as much as some other guys in the 1077th since my battalion tended to be stationed in reserve. I did manage to get a promotion from private first class to specialist due to my work in neutralizing a HFY bunker that had my company pinned. Good work, but nothing too special. I was more happy none of our guys were hit. It would take another 3 months before the planet was declared completely secure, but soon after the link-up, the 13th Army Group was pulled and replaced by the 26th. As the other planet in the system was being taken care of by a different regional army, we were detached from the 2nd RA and headed off to our next target in the first line of the HFY's defensive perimeter, another inhabitable planet called Erilon. I know I'm giving very broad overviews, but you gotta remember, at this point I'd been in for nearly a year. If I went into real detail, which I could thanks to my neural implant's malfunction, I'd be here for days. Plus, as you probably know, there is the campaign that resulted in me being as famous as I am. I do want to get to that, but I want people to know there was a lot more I went through, and thanks to this book's format, I get to talk about whatever I want, unlike when I did those war bond tours. When I get to that campaign, I'll give you all the details. I'm also telling you about the other units that fought alongside mine, because I want to keep reminding people that for every hero they hear about, there's 500,000 men whose stories are barely talked about, if they are at all, or even can be. My accomplishments were amazing, I admit, but neither me nor any of those other guys they call heroes could have done the job alone. As I was saying, after Ulva, we were then sent to Erilon. As the rest of the 2nd Regional was still busy securing Ava, the 13th Army Group was transferred to the 6th Regional Army, which contained the 67th, 99th, and 21st Army Groups. Erilon was much the same as Ava, 2 million HFY, spread out over 2 continents, jamming from altar towers that prevented orbital bombardment. It again took 3 months to effectively secure the planet. This time, the entire regional army was replaced by another one that would take care of the task of completely securing the planet. The sixth was needed elsewhere. By now we had secured 95% of the Hyades cluster and were through the Hudzai's outer line. Now we started to hit more determined resistance. The next place the sixth regional was sent to was the planet of Oberon. Recon suggested roughly about 7.5 million Hudzai, and this time, the planet only had a single big continent. As expected, more altar jammers made a ground invasion necessary, and we noticed an increased amount of anti-air and anti-space weapons, so the ride-in would be deadlier. With the increased number of enemy troops, the 6th was joined by the 4th, 14th and 22nd regional armies for a total of over 8 million men and women. An interesting note about the 22nd Regional is that one of its units was the 679th Infantry Division, one of the only all-female units in the UEE military. While I just like to point that out as an interesting tidbit, I am mentioning them for a reason which I'll explain later. Of the few all-female units, most were stationed on garrison duty. However, the commander of the 679th, Major General Kira Natoba, wasn't having any of that and had enough pull to get her division sent to the front. Anyway, we breached Atmo, and an entire armory of SSMs and SAMs was shot at us. As normal, the SSMs were rendered defunct by jammers and the effectiveness of the SAMs was drastically reduced. The sheer number, however, made sure more T-45 SAMs were taken out on the way down than had been down during Ava and Erelon combined. It always makes me mournful that so many of my comrades were killed before they even had the chance to do their job. That's nothing against the pilots though. T-45 pilots had balls of steel to do their job, because at least us in the hold couldn't see the sheer chaos going on outside. Those guys had to see all these missiles flying past, sometimes coming so close they could have reached outside and touched them, birds getting hit, explosions from premature detonating missiles. We had screens that could show us the outside of the ship once we'd landed, so we knew where the enemy was, but the pilots always kept them off until then. They did everything they could to get us where we needed to go without landing as a fireball. Once we got to our landing zone, an open field on the west side of the continent, we could hear as rounds started impacting the hull. This was our first hot landing. We expected it since, due to the size and layout of the continent, and the number of Hudzai present, every reasonable landing zone was able to be identified and guarded. Still, there wasn't a single one of us that wasn't scared shitless. Once the ramp lowered, hell broke loose. As we rushed out of the hold, rounds from the other side of the field cut down 24 of us within moments of becoming exposed. Still, we continued piling out until the last man left the hold. The T-45 lifted off, making us exposed from a full 360 degrees, before we went face down in the dirt to avoid the rounds that buzzed over our heads and thumped into the ground around us. I could see the other 4 companies of the battalion, as they too poured out of their T-45 SED and took casualties. We did have a problem aside from being shot at. One of the men killed as they exited the ship was our commanding officer, Captain James Horn. Our second-in-command, Lieutenant Davis, had also been wounded and was unconscious. That left First Sergeant Clarence as our leader. Tough guy, but he was proving to be a little shaky in combat. Now that shit was really going down, he completely froze up. So pretty much all of our company's top leadership was out at the same time we were having shots coming ever closer. If we stayed there, we were gonna be picked off one by one. So I went on instinct and lifted my head for a split second to look for our air attack director. I ignored the buzz of a round that had to have missed my head by 2 inches, dropped back down, and crawled over to him. I asked him if he had anything available, and he said they had a couple of warhogs nearby, but they'd need something to mark the enemy. I risked another peek above the grass, and was just able to make out some of the HFY's positions on a gently sloping hill to the east that seemed to be the source for most of the accurate fire, as well as a wad of trees nearby that had figures in it I could make out. Problem was that we were backed against a similar-looking hill, and I didn't want any accidents. I grabbed the blue smoke grenade from my chest and told him to tell the pilots to lay waste to that clump of trees and anything else within 100 yards of the blue smoke. Once he said he understood, I stood and just took off. Even with my implant, most of what I remember is just sprinting as fast as I'd ever run directly at that hill, occasionally going slightly to the left and right to make myself a bit harder of a target. I found out afterwards that I had run over 500 yards in less than 90 seconds, but at the time, it seemed to take years. It said you can't actually feel as mass accelerator rounds come past you, but I say whoever claims that is full of shit, because I know I felt them as some of those rounds whizzed right past me. I'd find soon that I'd actually been hit once, but only by the lightest of grazes, just enough to tear one of my sleeves slightly and draw some blood. I still haven't really figured out my religious leanings, but something had to have been watching over me. There was no reason I should have made it to that slope. None. But I did, and once I was there I went to throw the smoke, but thankfully, my hyper-focused brain had enough time to let me know I hadn't pulled the pin. I corrected that, and yucked that thing as hard as I could towards the hill before dropping to the ground and crawling my ass back the way I'd come. Even with my knee and elbow pads, I still scuffed myself up pretty good, but I did manage to get to something close to a safe distance when I heard that oh-so-familiar sound of the A-100's whiny-ass engines over the din of the gunfire. I didn't bother to look, but just listened as they screamed in, and one of them let loose with his rockets, and the other dropped his load of bombs. The thud of the explosions, just 100 yards behind me, were both exhilarating and terrifying at the same time, both because I knew the enemy was now getting hit back, but also because I knew I was still in the killing field. Knowing the A-100 pilots would be looking for any movement, I made the insane decision to stop crawling. I laid there, as still as my racing heart and mind would let me, and waited for the warhogs to come back around. As soon as I heard the first of the 40mm rounds be fired, hoping that if they were firing, they wouldn't be able to then readjust their aim low enough and fast enough to hit me, I jumped to my feet and sprinted back to my company. I did get shot at on my run back, but they were now wildly inaccurate. Soon as I got back inside of the hasty perimeter that Davis, who had since regained consciousness, had formed, I fell to the ground, completely out of breath. Some of the guys came over to see if I was all right, but I just waved them off since I couldn't say or do anything except focus on breathing. After a while, I finally caught enough of my breath to sit up. Davis was sat in front of me getting his bandages changed. It was then that I realized the sound of shooting had stopped. We got lucky. Turned out that the HFY on that hill and in those trees were the only ones close to our LZ, and the warhogs that either taken them out or caused any survivors to retreat. David looked at me and asked what had convinced me that what I had just done was anything approaching a smart idea. I just looked at him and shrugged. Truth was, there was no thinking. Aside from that, if we didn't do something quick, most of us would probably be dead. I'd get a medal and commendation, but that wasn't even a consideration. Stay alive and kill the enemy. That was the goal, and thankfully, I'd managed to do it. As the battalion got organized and prepared to move on and link up with the rest of the division, I took a moment to get some food. That's when a very close friend of mine, Henry, joined me. Henry and I went way back, pretty all the way to the start. We were born on the same day and in the same hospital. We grew up together and did everything together. One of the best benefits OUOS gave me was the ability to fight alongside him. We chatted for a moment before he said that while what I'd done was amazing, I was not allowed to get myself killed before him. I chuckled, slapped him on the shoulder and said I'd be sure to get his permission before doing so. His sense of humor always got at least a snort of enjoyment out of me. The rest of the 6-month campaign for Oberon was just as crazy. Whoever the Hardzai commander was, he was skilled. Way I heard it, a lot of the generals were impressed with his command of tactics and strategy. In the end, he still lost the planet and 6 of his 7.5 million men, but he did manage to inflict 3 million casualties on us. Took the 14th and 22nd to below 70% strength, and reminded us as we crossed the border and started driving into enemy territory, that we were fighting an enemy that had every intention of winning, and if not successful at that, take as many humans with them as possible. A reminder that was only to be reinforced soon. A final note about Oberon, which may seem a little strange to note here, but will have a point later, was that while the 1077th was waiting to be transported back up to the 5th Fleet and move on to the next planet, me and a few of the guys got to meet the women of the 679th when they arrived at the spaceport. While the 1077th was fighting its way down the west coast, the 679th were dropped into what they discovered was the most heavily defended of our initial landing areas. Unlike with us, a significant Hardzai presence of 20,000 was in the immediate area with another 80,000 or so within a day's movement. That meant they outnumbered the 679th and the handful of nearby 104th Tank Division units by over 4 to 1, with help from 104th Tank and the Warhogs of the 7th Attack Wing. The 679th killed or captured over 50,000 of those Hardzai within 2 weeks, while suffering only 3,000 dead and wounded, with the 104th suffering another 1,000. It was a feat nobody could have predicted, and even to this day some believe it is exaggerated. If you've seen them fight, however, you know it's true. When they walked their way into the main terminal of the spaceport, a lieutenant general that was standing near the door with his staff was the first to notice them enter and shouted, "R10 Chun." Now this man, General Hotol, had a very distinctive voice, and was in command of the men guarding the spaceport, so even those that weren't looking at him knew what he sounded like. So without hesitation, everyone jumped to their feet and stood at attention, expecting to see an officer with a rank high enough to get a general to call the room to attention for them. Even once it was seen, it was the women of the 679th. Nobody moved an inch, partially out of protocol, but also because everyone in that terminal now had a healthy respect for the 679th. They'd distinguished themselves in several previous battles, but their actions on Oberon solidified their reputation as one of the finest units in the UEE. Another thing to note is that normally, the one who calls a room to attention doesn't salute. General Hotol, however, did so, even though the people walking past were only NCOs and enlisted. UEE military custom does not require an officer to initiate a salute to those of lower rank, unless the person with lower rank has certain authorities and responsibilities, such as the captain of a ship. However, he understandably believed these ladies deserved the gesture and the respect. After all, a salute is more than just an exchanged honor, it's a recognition of a soldier's commitment and abilities. As they walked past, each and every one of us did the same because we all agreed with Hotol that they deserved it. After we left the planet, we did get a month-long bout of rest back on Ava before moving on. Of course, I call it rest, but a lot of us still assisted with some reconstruction effort. Still, better than having just gone straight into the next fight, and fucking Christ, would we need it. Hell, I'm sure if anyone knew what was to come, we'd have gotten a little more time to heal. Once our month was over and our ranks had been replenished and we were resupplied, we loaded up onto ships attached to the 2nd Fleet and set off for our next fight. We'd been detached from the 6th RA and sent back to the 2nd, which had just finished their own bit of R&R. The 26th Army Group had been transferred out, but the 43rd and 1st Army Groups were still there. The 4th spot in the RA was filled by the 1st Guards Tank Group. This clued us into something much bigger going on, since the 1st Guards were one of only 3 units allowed to perform guard duty in Cairo for the Tomb of Cyrus. They were supremely trained, equipped, and had a reputation for unbreakable discipline. Each of them had not only the training to operate their fleet of M8 main battle tanks and M6 infantry fighting vehicles, but also the A-100 Warhog, F-70 Starstreak, and the C-250. They were even trained to fight as proper infantry should their vehicle be destroyed or disabled. They were far and away some of the best. As far as I knew at the time, they had not actually partaken in the war at all, and it's now known that they were never intended to. Like me, however, events changed that. They'd ride with us into our next campaign, a campaign which was already raging, and would become host to several of the bloodiest and most prolonged battles in the history of the UEE, surpassing even some of the worst from the final war. It was also the first campaign fought solely within the Hudzai Empire, and was a sign of how this war would go from here on out.